Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
In some ways, he endures despite himself, and especially among people who profess to dislike him. So, the events you mention, of course, are Gandhian insofar as they are non-violent forms of collective mass protest, which is what he specialized in, and whose appeal is a moral appeal. They are not necessarily political demands in some kind of conventional sense. Of course, they also are that, but it's the moral emphasis that overrides, I think, and that made these events and these great demonstrations what they were. And in that sense, Gandhi is with us still. I'm reminded that even his great rival Ambedkar continues to use the category satyagraha, which of course is a Gandhian coinage. And he knows it is a Gandhian coinage. He does it and he uses it to the end of his career. So even an Ambedkar understands that, there is something going on here which it would be foolish to throw away. And Satya in Satyagraha, of course, it's about the struggle for truth. It's not simply for rights or interests or anything like that. And that is what allows for such movements to claim a kind of universality and to encapsulate an ideal.
Dr. Faisal Devji is Professor of Indian History at St.Anthony's College, University of Oxford. In this episode of BIC Talks, Professor Devji is in conversation with writer and journalist Vaibhav Vats, where Dr. Devji provides a glimpse into the range and spectrum of his research and writing across several books, touching on history of Indian diaspora and identity drawn from personal history, enquiring into Gandhi and decoding his continually evolving understanding of sacrifice, violence, and non-violence through the lens of the Mahabharata, understanding the dynamics of personalities like Jinnah, Ambedkar, and Nehru while drawing parallels with the current dispensation, and communal and political climes. Dr. Devji speaks of the essence of non-violent protest that endures due to the moral emphasis that overrides any political appeal, which has ensured that Gandhi stays put in our collective imagination. Over to Vaibhav.
Welcome, Professor Devji. I'm really excited to do this. And the question I would like to start with is, how did Faisal Devji become Faisal Devji? Briefly, in The Impossible Indian, you mention a childhood in Africa, in Dar es Salaam, which, as I read it in Delhi, seemed wondrous and magical to me. And if you could speak a little bit about your early formative influences and how you came to develop a relationship with ideas.
Pleasure to speak with you, Vaibhav. I'm one of those people who, and they're not that many of us, but not that few either, called the East African Asian in this country, in the United Kingdom. And as you know, these communities have been present on the East African coast and in the interior for well over a century, in many cases for many centuries. And, I come from a family which is from Gujarat, from coastal Gujarat, Kutch, and along with many other such families, they had been trading with the East African coast for some time, which is why I was born there. And, when I was growing up, India, because I had not been to India and my parents had not been to India, they were also born in East Africa. And so we lived in an Indian community, in part, in places like Zanzibar and Dar es Salaam. But, India was a kind of semi-mythical place for us. And sometimes when we used to go to the beach, we used to think that we could somehow see it across the sea. But apart from eating Indian food and Indian films and all the rest, I guess the intellectual stimulus was initially Gandhi, because my father was a great admirer of his and had the famous portrait of Gandhi sitting at his spinning wheel at his office. And that, in a way, was my first introduction to an India that was not simply cultural pleasure, but had something greater to say to us all and indeed to the world. But it took me a long time to return to Gandhi, from the time I was introduced to him in my childhood. But I was very glad when I did finally get back to him when I was in the US, basically, as a graduate student. And though I've written a book, I continue writing essays and articles and things like that. And through Gandhi, a lot of the rest of Indian political thought has opened up to me, including people like Ambedkar, who was his great rival, or Jinnah, who was another kind of rival. So in a way, Gandhi has become the medium through which I can approach Indian political thought more generally.
So it's probably a cliche, but your childhood reminds me of Naipaul's The Bend in the River. I once heard Akar Patel, who's this intellectual in India, call it the most astute portrait of Gujarati masculinity. And it's a bit surprising because it comes from an Islamophobic writer who also happened to be brilliant. Could you tell me a little bit more about what that diasporic landscape was like? Because there's no Gandhi in A Bend in the River. So how was there a lot of intermixing, and how did sort of Gandhi appear? What was its meaning in that sort of setting that you described?
Yeah, well, Gandhi does make a brief appearance in The Bend in the River because the hero Salim goes to the Indian High Commission where he sees the portraits of Gandhi and Nehru, and Naipaul, being whom he was, says quite nasty things about them all. And it basically says, it gets to your point about masculinity, that these great Indian heroes existed to deprive actual Indians of their own masculinity. They had to abase themselves before Gandhi and Nehru. So it's not a very kind reference to either of those men. But you're right that Naipaul was a brilliant writer. And I happen to think, but then I'm partisan because I'm from East Africa, that A Bend in the River, which begins somewhat on the coast and then moves into the interior of what becomes the Congo, is an exquisite, limpidly written book, which, of course, as you know, is a kind of retelling of Conrad's famous novel, The Heart of Darkness. And Naipaul, as a diasporic Indian himself from Trinidad, I think understood these societies, these diasporic societies, with a kind of intensity and even compassion that you don't necessarily find in some of his other writing. So here, he has a Muslim as his hero, a Muslim figure, and religion is not a real issue in A Bend in the River, in part because he also understood that in a place like East and Central Africa, there was no religious divide between Hindus or Muslims or Christians or Sikhs or Jains or whoever. And that's in part because the Indians were an ethnic minority and were defined racially rather than through their religious or linguistic even identities. So it's a really compassionate portrait, I find. And I suppose it's exotic in some way, but, I wonder if he himself realized that, unlike Trinidad or Fiji, these are places that are quite far away from India. East Africa is much, much closer, has a much longer history of movement, migration, influence. And that kept the East African Indians attached to India in good and bad ways. In good ways because they were much closer, and they could have sort of marriage relations, and bring wives or husbands from India. And it happened in terms of both the sexes. But it also, in bad ways, meant that they were attuned to and held in thrall almost by Indian social norms, conservative social norms. So in terms of caste, and, there was very little intermarriage. They all got along with each other, including upper and lower castes. But the boundaries still remained quite strict for the most part. So, in some ways, as contrasted with Fiji or Trinidad, where the ancestry was often uncertain because we're talking about indentured populations as well, and without direct access back to India, Africa was curiously, or not so curiously, the relationship with India was more intimate, though, of course, the place where they lived was quite different in other respects. But now that you ask this question, it makes me think that intimacy, in fact, has been the great leitmotif of my own work. Intimacy not only as a form of friendship and conviviality and all those other good things, but also as a site of enmity and conflict and hatred and violence.
What is really fascinating and unique about your work is that you locate these seminal events, such as the formation of Pakistan, not as is often done within the history of the subcontinent, but within global histories and global ideological currents. And part of it's clear to me is your peripatetic background. But what were your intellectual influences? What were your intellectual inspirations? Where did you look to when you started to sort of take this approach and started forming your worldview?
Yeah, I don't want to be too biographical about it, but I guess, when we migrated, in the case of my family from Tanzania to Canada, suddenly being East African became a meaningless identity, more or less meaningless. Even in a place like Canada or the UK, where East Africans are actually a fairly significant part of the South Asian population. And so we, for the first time, came into touch with large numbers of people who had come from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, whom we would never have come into touch with had we remained in East Africa. And there was a kind of process of identification in some ways. And you were also identified as Indian or Pakistani or whatever. And so the East African element kind of sort of phased itself out. And you see this even in Britain today, which is very unusual. In British official forms, whether it's censuses or anything else. On the one hand, the category Asian, which came from East Africa, by the way, after the partition of India, no one knew what to call these people, whether they were Indians or Pakistanis, so they were called Asians. A usage, of course, that is completely novel and unfamiliar in South Asia itself. And when the Asians come to Britain, they bring the term Asian with them, so to define all the South Asians. But what I've noticed recently is that they're all starting to identify with the nation states. So now on British governmental forms, you can identify yourself as Asian and their subsets, Asian Indian, Asian Pakistani, Asian Bangladeshi. East Africa is not there. Neither is Fiji or Trinidad, or they've all been absorbed into the South Asian nation state framework. So that lengthy diversion is only to suggest that the kind of East African element has become recessive and private and secretive. And so there's been a kind of enforced, in some sense, identification because one is identified by the nation state. And so one has to engage with it for good or for ill. So that's one thing, I would say. The other thing is being in diaspora means that you have both a kind of sense of closeness, but also distance from these places, from a country like India, and are also forced to answer for it in many ways. If something happens there, politically, you somehow get to represent it, whether you like it or not. So it places a kind of burden, but also privilege on people in the diaspora. And I just wonder whether, that is in part my own inheritance. I haven't given it too much thought. But if you will, it's the distance, but also simultaneously the intimacy that makes for the effort not only to turn towards South Asia, but also to place it in a more global, as you were suggesting, Vaibhav, global context.
So Gandhi is perhaps one of the few heroes from history that I have, and given the turn that Indian politics has taken, I find myself turning to Gandhi more and more, like in moments of despair and doubt. And one of those moments was the re-election of Narendra Modi in 2019. And the moment when I started reading The Impossible Indian was in quite extraordinary circumstances. And I think of it now, the protests of Shaheen Bagh and the Citizenship Act were at zenith. And I had this strange, while in the day I read your book over 2-3 days at the Nehru Memorial Library in New Delhi, because I didn't own a copy. And then in the evening, I would go to, the library would close and I'd head to Shaheen Bagh. So it was this strange sort of dialectic where I was reading you in the afternoons and going to Shaheen Bagh in the evenings. And my starting question in particular about that book would be that given the volume and range of work on Gandhi, on all sorts of aspects, when did you begin to feel that there were many things about Gandhi that had not been said and that you wanted to say in the book that became The Impossible Indian?
Well, I suppose, let's go back to Naipaul for a while. The way he presents Gandhi and Nehru in A Bend in the River as these sort of life-denying heroes who strip Indians of their own masculinity. I don't happen to agree with that judgment, but what struck me was that Gandhi in particular had become too much a possession of the Indian nation state, whichever party is in government. And that he was, in fact, a much more interesting and radical thinker than he had been made to appear as an icon of the state. Now, of course, I understand he is the father of the nation, indubitably, and he has to be present in the iconography of the state. And yet, what I saw in Gandhi was an anti-statist thinker, almost an anarchical thinker, as he called himself, a philosophical anarchist on many occasions. So I was interested in how to, as it were, rescue Gandhi, if you will, or at least one part of him, from the close embrace of the nation state. And see what he had to tell us when not being seen as father of the nation. And that's the way it started. And that made me think that Indian political thought in the 19th and 20th century was actually not uniformly and obsessively directed towards the making of a nation state, or at least of a centralized nation state. And that there were many different directions in which thinkers went. And Gandhi is, if you will, only the most important of them. And if one can say that of Gandhi, who is the kind of truly iconic figure of the nation, then the entire picture and landscape changes. So that, if you will, that was my initial form of approach.
I mean, this reminds me a little bit of Ashish Nandi's essay on Godse, and which essentially, as I understood it, was that Gandhi was essentially a radical and conservative garb. And I mean, Nandi's thesis that Godse as an enemy could see his sort of complete upending of Indian social norms so clearly. I think, was that also part of your sort of manner of thinking, that you wanted to sort of take off this conservative garb the Indian nation state had given him, almost sort of Nehruvian garb of sort of a nation builder?
Yeah, I mean, Ashish Nandi, of course, has been for decades now the most extraordinarily fertile thinker. This extraordinary imagination, and he works in these somewhat idiosyncratic and speculative ways, which I really like, I really appreciate. So he really did a great deal to open up all kinds of fields, not least Gandhi, of course, and to uncover the kind of radical nature of what we had taken thus far to be a standard story, a virtuous story of the making of the Indian nation. The virtue remains, but the radicalism actually expands beyond it. And one of the reasons I call my book, The Impossible Indian, is to suggest that it's actually impossible to corral and to cloister this kind of thinking, in this case, particularly that belonging to Gandhi, but one can also say the same actually about Ambedkar, into the carapace of a conventional nation state of the kind everyone understands that exists all over the world. Ambedkar too, after all, ends up abandoning both the constitution and Nehru's cabinet. And ironically, quite like Gandhi, turning towards the social and turning towards religion, very much like his great enemy, Gandhi. So there too, even the great framer of the Indian constitution cannot be held by it. So there's something, more general going on here, which I was interested in.
One of the striking ideas in The Impossible Indian was Gandhi's disdain of history. And I'd just like to quote you a little bit. You write, in this sense, Gandhi's non-violent revolution was a fundamentally conservative one, since he remained uninterested in beginnings or endings, and was happy for all manner of institutions and practices to exist as long as they abjured while. Indeed, he may well be described as the only mass leader of the 20th century who not only disdained history, but also neglected the ideology that made of it an argument for the achievement of some utopia. Could you elaborate a little bit on how you came to this conception of Gandhi, and how and why Gandhi himself was able to stay clear of ideological utopias in an age of ideological utopias?
Yeah, he's such an interesting figure because he seems to specialize in modes of escape. His critique of the colonial is not simply a critique of colonialism as a specific historical project, but of any kind of hegemonic project which seeks to capture people's thoughts and emotions and aspirations. And he is the great Houdini type, as it were, escape artist of politics, because when you look at so many of his interventions in politics, they are about refusing the categories that had become dominant. So during the First World War, and I've written somewhere else about this, Gandhi engages with the war from its very beginning, from 1914, when he's raising an ambulance corps for service in France while he's in London, to recruiting soldiers for it in India in 1918. You think he's actually engaging with the war, but he doesn't care about the war at all. The war does not define his projects. He actually manages to divest the war of its hegemonic character and subverts it from within almost. If he's capable of doing that, to the war, to a world war, the First World War, no less. He does it routinely through his career. So, that is now history. To turn to the specificity of your question, is one of these hegemonic categories, right? So it had, from the 19th century, say from the middle of the 19th century, it had become impossible to think about freedom and nationality without thinking historically. That, somehow we have to recover the glories of our past. Somehow we have to identify with those glories. Somehow we have to get rid of the more recent history of India, et cetera, et cetera. And there are, right-wing and left-wing ways of doing this. Nehru, for instance, is the left-wing way of doing this. His discovery of India is historical through and through, right? It's a way of understanding India entirely in historical terms. Now, Gandhi is not so keen on history for many reasons. One, of course, he sees history as one of the, if you will, narratives or categories, better put, which allows for colonial domination. That colonialism itself is based on the language of history, which is why the colonial state can suggest that Indians are backward and they need to somehow catch up in historical time. And the British are there to enable that catching up, this pedagogic project. And once they actually become modern, then they will be free. That's an entirely historical narrative. And of course, the other kinds of narratives about Indian backwardness, etc. So Gandhi realizes that though, many of his nationalist compatriots are keen on recovering the past and history and all the rest, in fact, history is as much responsible for India's colonization, history as a form of knowledge, and therefore it's vitiated as an instrument to achieve freedom. He also really realizes that in his own time, new Indian identities are being built up, which are entirely historical. And by historical here, I don't mean accurate. I mean, they use the language of history to shape fantasies. So, Muslim history, Hindu history, different kinds of caste histories, and that these historical narratives all depend upon resentment of various kinds, which is what the language of history does. We were conquered by these people, we were oppressed by these people, we were, whoever those might be, they might be the British, they might be fellow Indians, and we need to now free ourselves and recover it, all through a historical narrative. And so for him, the language of history was deeply violent and reactionary. It was violent by nature also, quite apart from the Indian case, because he defined historical narrative as being the kind of telling of the past in which violence is the only actor. Only violence makes history. And so for Gandhi, nonviolence does not have a history. It cannot have a history. That events are made only through violence. So in order to be nonviolent, you literally have to abandon the language of history. Now, what does he turn to? He turns to myth, if you will. And as I always tell my students, the myth and the myths in this case, or mythology, whether it's the Ramayana, whether it is the Mahabharata, it could be anything. And as I always tell my students, this actually is the great inheritance of philosophy. If you look at the Greeks, Plato, etc., they constantly are referring to myths, and they make myths because myth is a way of thinking about a problem philosophically in a way that history does not allow you to do. Also, you do not identify strongly with mythical narratives in the way that you do with historical ones, because everyone understands that the problem is a philosophical problem and therefore a political problem. So if you take a mythopoetic form, the question of the treatment of Sita by Rama, there is no easy answer to that. You can have a feminist telling, you can have other kinds of tellings, but it remains a problem that you have to return to over and over again. Or the problem of the Mahabharata, was it right to fight this war, given what happens in the end? The Kali Yuga emerges, right? These problems can never be resolved in the way historical problems pretend to be resolved. So they are actually philosophical inquiries into, if you will, perennial problems. They are not only about those texts or those heroes. And when Gandhi turns to myth in preference to history, he turns from the violence of a kind of purely instrumental form of politics to a philosophical way of understanding politics. from which history has been excised. And I think this is what is so important about his denial. But again, how does he manage to escape almost single-handedly the prose of history when everyone around him is, trying to achieve some kind of historical end? And of course, one of the things Gandhi says in his denial of history is that it goes directly to his ideas about means and ends. All right, that since non-violent action is action that relies upon the virtuous means deployed, it cannot consider the ends. So you're not meant to sacrifice means for ends. And the ends, of course, are always in the future. And so you cannot have an instrumental view of the future because, of course, that future, even if you achieve what you want, will always have a set of inadvertent consequences and will perpetuate violence rather than resolving it, because if you use violence, you perpetuate it. So you need to focus on the present, and the present is the time of myth, not the time of history.
No, actually, this ties in perfectly to the next question that I wanted to ask, which is what fascinated me so much about The Impossible Indian, that how you sort of bring about, and convincingly, Gandhi is a non-teleological thinker, which is again tied to the anti-utopianism of his ideas, his disdain for history, and they're fascinating passages that you bring from Gandhi, which I'd never read anywhere before, where he tells the British, leave India to God or anarchy. And I'll quote a little bit where he says that the British will have to take the risk of leaving India to chaos or anarchy. And then towards the end, he says that if the British were not here, we would still go through the fire, no doubt, but that fire would purify us. Could you elaborate a little bit on what made Gandhi a thinker of the present? Like, why did he own the present in this sort of way? And so opposed to any form of anticipation of outcomes projected onto the future. And his sole concern, as I understood it, was ethical action in the present and a kind of purification through suffering, which is just fascinating.
Yeah, it's, as a historian, you can imagine, in a way, it was a hit to me because, I think historically. And so to have a thinker who is against that way of thinking is, it's an unexpected both challenge, but also, if you will, a gratification, because it's nice to see the limits of one's own, as it were, profession. And there's nothing more pleasurable than not just seeing the limits, but espying how you might transcend them. And Gandhi gives that to you over and over again, like a free gift, So now what is this, what does he do? For him, morality is only practicable and to be practiced in the present. Otherwise, it's meaningless. This goes back to this point about you can't sacrifice the present for the future. You actually live in the present. And the problem is that we've forgotten how to live in the present. We've forgotten to enjoy and to appreciate and to judge and to be virtuous in the present, which is where we all live. All right. And we're constantly giving it up to the future, or in terms of the historical consciousness, to the past by obsessing about the past. And both these things for Gandhi are bad things. And he counsels that we should be as children. Gandhi is one of those interesting thinkers for whom the child is a great heroic figure. And like children, we should be able to take pleasure in and live in the present. And now what does that do? That doesn't mean that we should be heedless about the future. But what focusing on virtuous means in the present does is it actually opens up the future to many more virtuous possibilities than otherwise. If we have a single-minded, instrumental approach that we need to achieve this particular end, and everything can be dispensed with, you might achieve that end. That end might prove to be not so nice when it arrives, but also by achieving that particular end, you discount all the other possibilities that were inherent in the situation. And what Gandhi, as a pluralistic thinker, wants is to actually open up the possibilities, that there should be many more possibilities, which of course he thought was also the properly democratic way of proceeding. That it is not simply, a zero-sum game. Both our moral lives and our political lives should not be considered a zero-sum game. It's either one way or no way. There have to be a set of possibilities. Now, of course, when he's commenting on the Gita, he does comment on a situation where, for someone like Arjuna, there is no other way. Right? The point of Arjuna's dilemma is that though he wants to flee, he toys with the idea of leaving the battlefield. He has been brought there by his own actions and the actions of others, and he now must go through with it. But Gandhi's point is, even at this moment, where choice has been excluded, moral choice, he has to do his dharma. Even at this moment, by actually focusing on means and the virtue of means rather than ends, Arjuna is capable of opening up the possibilities that have been foreclosed by his own prior actions. So in all of these ways, he's sort of basically circling around the question of the present and how to live in the present, which he thinks, is a quality we have actually lost, and we have lost it through industrial capitalism. We have lost it, through our heedless rush into the future. And so these ways of thinking are also connected to Gandhi's critiques of railways and trains and speed and all of these things, the products of colonial capital and the Industrial Revolution, which he thinks are inherently violent because they seek to literally run down entire times, temporalities, and people. And so you must live in the present and understand how virtue is only possible in the present.
Right. The other aspect of the impossibility, in which again really struck me, was how you sort of brought about Gandhi's radical pacifism. And the one thing that he shared with the likes of Mao and Lenin and Hitler was a complete commitment to his ideology and his willingness to pay any price for it. And essentially, as I understood this, that Gandhi did not cherish or fetishize life in the manner of human rights discourse today. And I'd just like to quote a couple of things which are fascinating. His advice to Jews to resist Nazism in a defined, non-violent way. And here again, he has that same language of purification through sacrifice, and where he tells them that the calculated violence of Hitler may even result in a general massacre of the Jews by way of his first answer to the declaration of such as hostilities. But if the Jewish mind could be prepared for voluntary suffering, even the massacre, I imagine, could be turned into a day of thanksgiving and joy. And that is just extraordinary. And the second passage that I'd like to quote briefly is the one in Hiroshima, where you describe, as the Mahatma put it when asked in an interview, the atom bomb had not rendered nonviolence meaningless. And he says, no, it is the only thing that the atom bomb cannot destroy. I did not move a muscle when I first heard that the atom bomb had wiped out Hiroshima. So what do you think made Gandhi arrive at such a view of not really having an excessive attachment to life, which I thought was a very useful way of thinking even during this pandemic that we're just getting out of?
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, in a way, the best way I can speak about it is to invoke another example I give in that book, which you will recall, which is in 1937, when German SS officer called Captain von Strunk comes to visit Gandhi at his ashram, and he's a henchman of Hitler's. This is just before the war begins, and he has been supplying arms to the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. He comes to see Gandhi, and he's interested, like fascists are, in questions of how to improve the life force and health and all the rest. And Gandhi tells him, this fellow comes and he says, well, it's too bad about the war in Spain, the violence dreadful, etc. And Gandhi says, no, on the contrary, what I really admire about you Europeans is your ability and your willingness to give up your lives. That is truly noble sacrifice, right? And that's what we can learn from you. But what I don't understand is your desire at the same time, which is a contradictory desire, to preserve and protect your lives. And those two things stand in contradiction to one another. The willingness to sacrifice life and the desire to preserve or protect it. And of course, they're bound together in other ways, where you often think you're sacrificing your life to protect the lives of others. Now, for Gandhi, the violence comes not out of the sacrificial element, it comes out of the protective element. That is precisely by making life the ultimate value or virtue that violence is encoded and built into moral and political life. So when to go to a slightly different time, so between 1937 and 1948, after the war, when Julian Huxley, who's Director General of UNESCO, writes to Gandhi because he's writing to all these eminent figures across the world, gathering opinions on the drafting of what is to become the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He writes to Gandhi, and Gandhi responds. He's on a train, and he writes a letter, from the train, and he says, "That's all very well, but I'm not really so keen on rights. I'm more inclined towards duties." Now, when you think about that comment, what's interesting is the chief right, of course, is the right to life. The highest duty is the duty to die, to give up your life. Now, for Gandhi, looking at these two things, it struck him that the right to life is the more violent, if you will, category, the more violent ideal. Why? Because it gets back to the questions we've been discussing earlier of means and ends and sacrificing the present for the future and all the rest. So that is not the kind of sacrifice Gandhi means. He also thinks that the right to life is actually not inalienable. It's given by states. It can be taken away by states. And that the focus on life is where violence comes out, where violence emerges from, because it is to protect and to preserve. It creates a hierarchy of lives more worth living and other lives which are less worth living and all the rest. And also it is not individual, it's institutional led. The thing about duty as in Dharma is that it belongs to individuals. It cannot be taken away from you. It really is inalienable, and it's democratic because everyone has their duty, whereas rights can, unreal in many ways for most people. And your duty, if your chief duty is sacrifice, that is through your duty that you can actually inadvertently, perhaps, but as a logical consequence, protect and preserve life. Without naming it as your chief value or as your core virtue. If you start with duty, he seems to be suggesting, you end up preserving and protecting life much more so than if you start with life as a right. So it's rights and duties, life and death, and the kind of sacrifice that is truly virtuous. And of course, Gandhi says this very early in his career when he's in Hind Swaraj, when he's commenting on the assassination of Sir Curzon Wiley by Madan Lal Dhingra. And he says about the so-called Indian terrorism of the day, Dhingra was noble in giving his life because he likes that, but he gave his life in the wrong way because he gave it through violence by killing someone. And those two things can actually be separated one from the other. And it's a sacrifice without violence, which is, of course, what Gandhi prefers, and which is what he thinks really can lead one to a non-violent way of living together. Now, it doesn't have to be sacrifice of one's life, something that extreme. It could be any form of sacrifice. And for Gandhi, this is not something exceptional. Because what he says is that all our societies, in fact, work by sacrifices of various kinds, not by the claiming of rights. So a very homely example, a mother will cook a dish that she doesn't like, but that her children like. That's a form of sacrifice. Mothers and fathers sacrifice for their children this way, children sacrifice for their parents, wives and husbands sacrifice for one another, lovers do so for each other, friends do so. And this is indubitably part of our everyday experience. We know this from experience. This is not something to be read in a book, all right? This is not simply the discourse of a guru that we can only aspire to. So Gandhi always begins with the ordinary, the quotidian, and the everyday. In that sense, he is this kind of philosopher. You must begin with what you already know. And if this is in fact how we all live, this is what allows us to live together, then why should it not be this way of thinking, this way of living, this kind of practice of sacrifice be expanded in, further and further in ever expanding circles, and include not just these ordinary quotidian forms of sacrifice, but even the greatest form of sacrifice, which is that of your life, which Gandhi also thinks is by no means unusual. In fact, it can be found in droves in the kind of violence in its perverted form in war. All right. So in these acts of militant terrorism, like assassination, or in war, where people sacrifice. So to return to the Gita, what Gandhi says in his 1926 commentary on the Gita is, when you look at the war of the Mahabharata, what is actually happening there? It is not that the evil army of Duryodhana is fighting because they are commanded by Duryodhana or that they are evil. In fact, they are not all evil. Duryodhana might be evil, but the people, including Karna, Bhishma, and Drona, who fight, or who are part of the evil army, are obviously there for very different reasons. And no army can hold together, in Gandhi's view, without sacrifice. That is to say, people are willing and must be willing to die for their comrades in arms, for their friends, for their preceptors. They are motivated by all kinds of desires and duties, very few, if any, of which have to do with the aims and intentions of the evil Prince Duryodhana or anyone like him. It could be any army. It could be Hitler's army. Now, that means that in Gandhi's view, evil itself depends upon goodness. Right? And so what goodness needs to do is to withdraw itself from evil, and evil will collapse. And that, of course, is called non-cooperation. So your complicity in evil, you must understand and withdraw it. And on the side of virtue, people must appeal to the goodness that is present even in the ranks of the evil. In this case, the army of Duryodhana. So there too, any army, he says, can only hold together through sacrifice, not through interest, not to self-interest. Otherwise, they'd all run away if they were self-interested. And it's not just fear that keeps them there. On the battlefield, anything can happen. So for Gandhi, he wants to make this audacious claim that even at the heart of evil lies goodness. And that goodness is defined by sacrifice. Sacrifice is something we all know. And there are many varieties of it, from fasting to spinning to dying. And there's nothing exceptional about it. And so that is where we must go, both to live a virtuous, nonviolent life, but also, and this is really crucial, to be able to appeal to the evil. So this goes back, Vaibhav, to your initial comment on Hitler and his advice to the Jews, because Gandhi's advice to Jews is precisely about this. You need to appeal to the goodness inherent, not in Hitler himself, perhaps, but among ordinary Germans who are part of his army. How do you do that? You do that by displaying that you, yourself, are a better representative of the virtue that they claim for themselves. So bravery, courage, sacrifice, right? And so do not allow yourself to be dragged away in the middle of the night. Make your resistance, nonviolent resistance, public. Of course, if you can flee Germany, please flee Germany. If you can fight, please fight. He's not against fighting in this sense. But if you can't do either of these things, then your duty is to rescue not only yourself and your future generations, if you will, from the humiliation of having become a victim, but to appeal to and convert your own enemy. So you're always an agent, you're never a victim. And that is true morality.
And one of the interlinked dualities that you, even in that fetishization of human life that you mentioned in the book, is how sort of that fetishization of life and its protection actually can produce enormous amounts of violence that we see in the post 9/11 world, and the sort of state violence. And so that's another interesting sort of duality. I'd like to move a little bit towards Gandhi's enduring global impact. And I think the year of 2019, 2020 was with Shaheen Bagh, Black Lives Matter, and his global impact to me remains absolutely stunning. And in a sense, do you think he was ahead of his time when so many other figures, charismatic figures like Mao, have lost relevance in global terms? I mean, why does Gandhi continue to endure?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In some ways, he endures despite himself, and especially among people who profess to dislike him. The events you mentioned, of course, are Gandhian insofar as they are nonviolent forms of collective mass protest, which is what he specialized in, and whose appeal is a moral appeal. They are not necessarily political demands in some kind of conventional sense. Of course, they also are that, but it's the moral emphasis that overrides, I think, and that made these events and these great demonstrations what they were. And in that sense, Gandhi is with us still. I'm reminded that even his great rival Ambedkar continues to use the category satyagraha, which of course is a Gandhian coinage. And he knows it is a Gandhian coinage. He does it and he uses it to the end of his career. So even an Ambedkar understands that there's something going on here, which is which it would be foolish to throw away. And Satya in Satyagraha, of course, it's about the struggle for truth. It's not simply for rights or interests or anything like that. And that is what allows for such movements to claim a kind of universality and to encapsulate an ideal, not simply a parochial, if nevertheless very justified set of claims. So often I think that Gandhi has been inherited despite and even against himself. And that's perhaps something he himself would have found amusing and even liked. This is a man, after all, who always, counseled that the ego should be reduced to zero, and who constantly despaired of his own title of Mahatma, and who used to say that he missed his days in South Africa where he was called simply Bhai, brother. So it's his focus on equality here that is, of course, crucial. So to repeat myself, in a way, I think that there's much to learn from Gandhi, but forgetting Gandhi is also important because it's a way of equalizing and of inheriting in a way that does not, to return to the Vase Naipaul image, involve abasement before any figure, whether it is Gandhi or anyone else, because it's the abasement before figures of power that is the problem in the first place. And Gandhi's aim was always democratic, which is also why he was so keen on foregrounding the needs of Indian peasants, and stressing the importance of the village, not simply because he had some idealized vision of the village, but because in his time most Indians lived in villages. Most Indians were rural people and peasants, etc. And therefore, any democratic society would have to take their needs into account first. They were the true majority of the country, whatever their religious and other affiliation. And so Gandhi is very keen on the village. And of course, this keenness has been dismissed as being simply romanticization and all the rest. There may well have been something of that, but there's always something in addition, something extra with Gandhi. He's too clever to permit himself to be encapsulated just by one way of thinking.
The two seismic events that we've had in India over the last 2 years, one, there was the Anti-Citizenship Act protests, epitomized in Shaheen Bagh, and then the farmer protests. And these are the two biggest sort of threats that the Modi regime has faced in terms of these social movements, which are also quintessentially Gandhian. And so it's interesting because even in the sun's heyday, Gandhi continues to haunt them. When the protests against the Citizenship Act erupted, I could almost sense this frustration among the Hindu right, the likes of Modi and Shah, at a moment when they had politically vanquished all their opponents, that they have to reckon with this old man again. And the killers of Gandhi, in a way, sense were aghast at Gandhi's refusal to die. And one passage which was really resonant to me at the time when I was reading your book and also going to Shaheen Bagh is where he talks about that is the beauty of Satyagraha. It comes up to oneself. One has to not go out in search of it. And that is something that was very true of that moment as well. So would you like to elaborate a little bit of what you made of the Shaheen Bagh movement, if you followed it closely at all, particularly in its Gandhian aspects?
Yeah, both these movements that you described, are extraordinary, as you say, in part because there seems to have been minimal formal institutional political impetus behind them. In fact, as far as I can tell, the various opposition parties, both centrally and regionally, were taken by surprise. So, they may have rushed some of them to associate themselves with these movements, but these are truly Gandhian movements because they come from, if you will, society, from the social. And that is what is extraordinary. Now, you can, if you'd like, link them to other movements, such as the, whether it's some of the so-called color revolutions of Eastern Europe or the Arab Spring protests or indeed Black Lives Matter, etc. So, these are, they have a global context as well. In India, of course, the Gandhi is inescapable in any such movement. So I was fascinated by their emergence because it showed that that the political party and institutionalized politics have not, if they were ever able to, hegemonize political space in India. That the social, which was Gandhi's ground as well, remains incredibly productive. Now, of course, the social doesn't belong to any one group or movement or ideal, and the right too focuses on the social. So in a way, Gandhi's inheritance is ambiguous in this sense because everyone can draw from it. When you look at movements like the RSS, which is a very extensive movement and bases itself entirely in the social, in society, its task is to remake society's social relations and social consciousness. There too, you see the dominance of the social, if you will, over the political. Though now, of course, there's a connection with formal politics. But what has always interested me about India is how, in part thanks to the colonial experience and to the national movement, how it is the social or society that remains the more authentic site for protest, for resistance, and for the remaking of politics itself, for all parties. And that the struggle really has to be conducted there. And this, in a way, is Gandhi's greatest inheritance because he's the one who begins that kind of social, not that there were no social movements in India before, but his by far the biggest. And they mobilize in a way that no previous movement could have mobilized. And they are both inclusive and political in a way that that prior movements could not have been. So the battle continues in the realm of the social. And today in India, it looks as if that is the only place where the battle is really continuing. It's not continuing in Parliament for various reasons. So, it really is, well, we all attend upon these movements to see what happens to them. Shaheen Bagh, of course, came to an end, those sets of protests, with the coming of the lockdowns and the pandemic. But it will surely have its own inheritance because it was India-wide. Delhi just named this one site, the most important perhaps site. And it involved a very diverse group of people, young people, in which, as you know better than I, Gandhi's portrait was omnipresent, along with Ambedkar. The two people who in history were apart here come together in a perfectly logical way, I would add, because this goes back to what I was saying about the importance of myth and philosophy. They do come together here, though historically they're split apart. And the Constitution as the document which both legitimizes these movements, but also which needs protection. And that's important because it's no longer the Constitution which protects. It's society which protects the Constitution. And that's an extraordinary and remarkable reversal, given the function of Constitution is actually to protect liberties, it's to protect citizens, it's to protect their rights, etc. And we've had this kind of reversal, and we haven't really attended to the implications of this act of protecting something that is meant to be protecting you. What is going on there? I don't know. The realm of parliament has been removed entirely from these protests. They're not even referring to parliament, whether to the government or the opposition. That's another really interesting thing that's happening. So all of which is Gandhian in many aspects.
I mean, just one observation on that would be that I feel that, and it's sort of a counterfactual. I'm not big on counterfactuals, but my sense is if Gandhi had not been assassinated, and obviously it's a big counterfactual, there is, if you look at his schedule for the next month, he was supposed to meet some social activists, and he was even interested in the Congress abolishing itself as a political party and becoming a social movement. And I wonder whether a part of the reason I think where the RSS view of India is on the ascendant is because the Congress is pretty much dead as a social movement, and that's the space that something like Shaheen Bagh enters into and occupies, because the Congress is no longer there. It's no longer there as a social movement defending the constitution. So as a counterfactual, do you think had Gandhi not been assassinated, would the Gandhian social movement or the Congress social movement been much stronger in India? Because as it's been that the RSS is the only party nationwide that is actually invested in social movement politics.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you say. I mean, it's difficult to know, of course, but in a way, there's been the big failure has been the failure of the constructive program and the inheritance of Gandhi's social movement, because one of the things, as you know, he did with independence is to make a division between those of his followers in the ashram who joined parliament, who joined the Nehru's cabinet, etc., joined government, and he was happy for them to do so if they had skills to offer, and others who he thought should work in society. And he was very keen that the constructive program should be where his movement was going next, and it should, in fact, oppose the government when the government needed to be opposed. One of the many tragedies of partition was that it suddenly catapulted Congress into a position of unrivaled power, which meant that, in a strange irony, you move from a multi-party, though very limited, colonially defined politics to, in effect, a one-party state in India after independence. And that, I think, is one of the great tragic moments of partition, which people don't think of. They think, of course, of the more brutal corporeal tragedies of people having to flee, refugees, murders, massacres, etc. And that is only correct. But constitutionally and politically, I can't help thinking that the making for a few decades of a one-party state at the center was a disaster. Now, what has happened to the Congress since then is also quite interesting, because in some sense, it has become a kind of Western-style liberal party, with minus its social movement. And maybe that social movement, it starts receding, perhaps even in the later years of Pandit Nehru, but certainly post-emergency and in Indira Gandhi, etc. But that has meant that it's become this, if you will, very familiar type of party, familiar in the West, whereas the BJP is the party that now has by far the largest social movements attached to it. So you're right. Now, I mean, Gandhi, one of the things he wanted to do, of course, before he was assassinated, I think it might even have been in a few days after the day of his assassination, he wanted to make a padyatra to Pakistan to make sure that people were safe there. That is to say, non-Muslim minorities were safe there, and that they could return to their homes, if only to be able to dispose of their properties, but hopefully to live there, because he was intent that minorities in both countries needed to return to where they came from. And that was the only way in which the subcontinent could live at peace with itself, instead of being internally divided, and by being internally divided, losing its own global status and potential. which it indeed has what has happened. The rise of China in a way has been contingent on this internal subcontinental disaster for India. So he was quite wise that indeed he says that towards the end of his life that this conflict will not end until and unless the refugees on both sides have received some measure of restitution. And I've often thought to myself, I'm wandering away from your question, Vaibhav, but that one way of thinking about a non-violent future for the subcontinent is to start with the families and the descendants of those refugees and make sure that they have perhaps initially special status in the countries of their ancestral origin. They can either move back there or they can have permanent rights or visas or whatever. And, through them, rather than having them be the obstacle for any future peace, they should be the primary mediators of peace by what the wrongs being done to them being recognized fully and fulsomely, and being given the right to whether it is to return or compensation. Now, this has happened to some small degree, but imperfectly with Bangladesh. So there is a precedent. Those Hindus, especially who were evicted or who fled, have been offered compensation by the Bangladeshi government. It has not been anywhere near what it should have been. But so we have a small precedent, and it's a small ray of light, as Gandhi himself might have said. So in this way, and to return to the Gandhi here, in this way, the moment of the greatest darkness can also be the moment of light. Because for Gandhi, the thing about nonviolence, what made it universal, was that unlike any other moral philosophy, it saw no limits to itself. So for Gandhi, nonviolence can operate anywhere, even in the middle of the battlefield, which is why Kurukshetra, the battlefield of the Mahabharata, is so important for him. Even in the middle of violence, in the middle of war, you can have the possibility of nonviolence. Sometimes the violence itself opens up these possibilities. And that was for him the sign of the universal import of nonviolence.
That's fascinating when you say that the minorities were being allowed to return as sort of the bridge to reconciliation. In a sort of naive emotional politics, Jinnah for many of us is like a historical villain, and much more, for secular Hindus, but above all for Indian Muslims who feel abandoned and much more vulnerable as a result of what he did. But I'm tempted to ask you whether the rise of Hindu nationalism, that in many ways feels irreversible, whether the influence of Jinnah as the proponent of the ideology of sectarian nationalism as the norm in South Asia will eventually outstrip that of Gandhi, because we almost feel like Gandhi is receding and Jinnah is ascendant, not just in Pakistan, but now increasingly in India as well, in the obsession with Pakistan and imitating that form of nationalism.
That's very interesting. I don't know. It's in some ways, of course, in Pakistan, all the Pakistani liberals are bemoaning the decline of Jinnah in their country, because for them, he is a secular figure. And a modern figure and a non-religious figure. But as Ashish Nandi has always pointed out, Savarkar on the Indian side is also, if you will, in many ways a modern and even secular or at least non-religious figure. So, and Nandi compares Jinnah and Savarkar. They have something in common and very much not in common, obviously. What interests me about Jinnah is, and this is something Gandhi understood, because I think in 1946, he says to Lord Casey, who is then governor of Bengal, that the problem with Jinnah is that he's too much of an idealist. He is the true idealist. Normally people think Gandhi is the idealist. And Gandhi, I think, correctly says that Jinnah is the idealist, and he himself, Gandhi, is the true realist here. Now, what did he mean when he said that? He meant that Jinnah understood politics in in purely idealistic terms. And in my own book on Pakistan as a political idea, I try to lay this out. They're perfectly coherent terms, but they do not take into account history, to go back to history, in a different way than Gandhi's abjuring of history. Right? So this is what I mean. So Jinnah basically seems to think that he starts out, of course, in Congress, and he comes to think that it sort of deals between the Congress and the League, and various forms of weighted and reserved representation are not doing the trick. So what do you need to do? In fact, things seem to be getting worse. Well, you need to partition the country, because what that will do is create a real Hindu majority in India and a real Muslim majority in Pakistan, and therefore real Hindu and Muslim minorities in both countries. And once you make this happen, then the communal issue will recede into the background, and economic issues will emerge in the forefront of politics. Now, why does he think this? He thinks this because he thinks that in colonial India, the problem is that there is no real majority, and therefore there is no real minority. There's no real majority because Hindus are split up by caste, etc., language, and all the rest. But also because Muslims are a majority in two significant parts of the country. Nevertheless, Muslims too are not a real minority because they are too numerous to be a minority, and they have regional majorities, but also because they too are split up by language, etc., etc. So what he thinks is that British colonial rule has led to the development of these categories like majority and minority, which are numerically defined, but which don't actually describe what is really the truth of society. And so they give rise to huge amounts of anxiety and violence. Now, instead of going along with Gandhi's view, which is to actually work on that, the intertwined and intimate relations that exist between majorities and minorities, which is what Gandhi thinks makes them violent in the first place. So typical of Gandhi, the very thing that provokes violence, which is to say that people are too intertwined and therefore they feel betrayed by their neighbors. That kind of hatred only comes with intimacy. You don't hate a stranger, that Gandhi thinks that the very thing that produces hatred can also produce love. And this is the ambiguity of nonviolence, that it's, but this is also the possibility of conversion from violence to nonviolence. Otherwise, there would be, if there was no connection between them, then you couldn't move from one to the other. Then you would be stuck in airtight compartments, the violent on one side and the nonviolent on the other. And for Gandhi, it's precisely because they're intertwined in this way that you can think about conversion. Because as I was saying in response to the earlier question, even evil is subtended by goodness. So you can have Karna and Drona and Bhishma in the army of the Kauravas. So instead of going along with Gandhi on this, what Jinnah thinks is that we need to actually make these groups, whether majorities or minorities or religious communities, even more distinctive. And finally, he thinks the way to do this is to partition. And now the partition, he's a lawyer, right? He's a very good, the best paid lawyer in India. And he thinks about partition weirdly in quite civilian and domestic terms. And he describes it often. He says, look, I'm a lawyer. I have divided people's properties on many an occasion. And, when the father dies and the two brothers quarrel, sometimes the best way to reconcile them is to partition the paternal property, and then the brothers become friends through contract. So what does he want to do? He wants to disentangle these groups to turn brotherhood into friendship. So he too doesn't have a vision of, endless enmity, but he thinks what you need is a contractual relationship. He's a lawyer, after all. Gandhi, though also a lawyer, doesn't like contracts and these sorts of things. He wants truth and love and friendship, right? So Gandhi's idea, Jinnah's idea of friendship is entirely contractual. And that is what partition is meant to do. And Jinnah thinks it's a wonderful thing before the riots begin, because he thinks for the first time in the history of the world, the social contract ideals of early modern European philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and Hume and Locke have finally, for the first time, been put into place in political reality in India. So what the British, etc., only imagined, what Rousseau in France and Hobbes in England imagined, we, the Indians, have actually made true. We have how? By a bunch of civilian leaders negotiating, they have decided to create two countries. That is an unprecedented phenomenon for Jinnah. Soon his, as it were, laughter or smiles turned into tears as the violence came to engulf both countries. So in a way, he dies a kind of tragic figure because he realizes, I suspect, that he was wrong. And which is why Gandhi describes him as an idealist, because he's working at this kind of level. On the one hand, the ordinary urban civilian level of the lawyer, dividing up an inheritance. On the other hand, in terms of European political philosophy, in both cases, he is unable to actually reckon with the violence of history itself, the very violence that Gandhi, in denying history, wants to get away from. Now, having told the story, I wonder if we can see the figures in the Indian right and the Hindu right today as being idealists in this manner. I don't know. It could be the case, despite their involvement in quite prosaic and non-idealistic politics on the ground, that some of them do have a vision of a perfectly pragmatic vision, which is what Jinnah thought he had too. It was pragmatism, right? It was idealism in the form that took itself to be pragmatic. They may think that, look, we have a very big and diverse country. We need to stop it from fraying around the edges. How do we do that? Well, we don't have a given majority, but we can create a majority. And what is the largest group in this country? In fact, it's a religious group, the Hindus. And so we need to organize the nation around this big majority. And that's, after all, what most European countries have done in the past. And so we are doing nothing unusual at all. This is utterly pragmatic. And once we do that, then the country and its borders are safe. And then everyone else can somehow be related to this core identity in various ways. You're not going to force people to all become Hindu. And all the violence will come out in the wash. I can imagine some people thinking along these lines.
Well, it's fascinating you say that, because that's the question actually on those lines I want to ask you next. And it's fascinating how you sort of describe Jinnah's fascination with Enlightenment thought. And you describe Muslim nationalism in colonial India as a politics of the will, politics of the pure idea in Muslim Zion. Whenever I read about Jinnah, I almost instantly see parallels with this fellow Gujarati Narendra Modi, because I see both as cold figures, calculating figures, impervious to human suffering, uncompromising, possessed of a fanatical reason. Do you think that? Do you feel that there are parallels between the two figures?
Yeah, again, it's a very interesting question. On the surface of it, clearly not. But what you say, of course, the kind of drivenness, the commitment, the obsessiveness of the politics, the desire to win all the time. The kind of unwillingness on occasion to compromise. On occasion, there are compromises, both Jinnah and Modi make. But I guess, with Jinnah at the end of his career, there seems to be these kind of strange and, unwarranted or hitherto unknown bursts of emotion, the reports we get. Now, those come out of the partition violence, when he seems to have understood something has gone terribly wrong. I don't know if we will see that with the Prime Minister, or if we have seen it. We do have, of course, the display of emotion and indeed tears on television, but those have been seen as being either not genuine or whatever, part of a political plan. So there is a place for emotion there in both figures. Otherwise, it's difficult to say, because at least I don't know the level of, Mr. Modi's religious commitments or his upbringing or anything like that. We know a bit more about Jinnah's. With Advani, of course, you know a bit more. A person who, from what one can tell, like with many Sindhi Hindus, is in quotes a Sikh in personal life, and so not conforming to a standardized vision of a Vaishnav, given his leadership of the Ayodhya campaign, which is by definition a Vaishnava campaign, though it was a pan-Hindu campaign. So there, and of course it is Advani who goes to Pakistan and says positive things about Jinnah, for which he's then raked over the coals in India. So there, Advani too, I think, is from Karachi or certainly from Sindh, where Jinnah was born. So there is much more resemblance between Advani and Jinnah. With Mr. Modi, he remains a quite mysterious figure. In that sense, he is like Jinnah, because Jinnah too, we know almost nothing about his private life, his personal life, almost nothing. And the same is true for the Indian Prime Minister today. He's actually quite a mysterious figure, and that he allows, therefore, for kind of identification. Jinnah, I say in my book, in a way worked as the lawyer of his community. He wasn't like them in any sense. So when they identified with him either as a lawyer figure or as a kind of future figure of Muslim modernity. But in every other way, he didn't look like them, he didn't speak like them, he didn't behave like them, With Modi, that's quite different because he really does, he has this charismatic presence, and there is an identification, full-scale identification. Now, how he manages it and with whom is unclear, because he's again, interesting comparison with Jinnah that you bring up. The changing costumes, which Jinnah also does. So he's either highly westernized or he is in the Sherwani and all, the Karakoram cap. Yeah. With the Indian Prime Minister, there are many more, as it were, costume changes. And appeals, very specific appeals to specific groups of people. And he's kind of Zelig-like figure it's possible to identify with. And that, I think, is something quite new. And those holograms, that are used during elections, and the masks that people wear, the Modi mask. So there's a kind of full-scale identification of a kind that perhaps it's due to social media, of the kind that you don't see with any of the figures of the 1940s. Indeed, not Gandhi himself. Even though there are loads of images of Gandhi around, there's not that kind of one-to-one identification. And so Gandhi, if the most charismatic figure in modern India, doesn't call for this kind of identification. Something has changed greatly in the meantime.
What really intrigued me about while I was reading Muslim Zion was when you talk about how Iqbal and Jinnah, they always want to escape the category of minority. And what struck me, just what I think are the commonalities between Jinnah and Modi, but I feel the projects are in a certain sense are opposed, that the Muslim nationalism perpetually wants to escape this category of the minority, while Hindu nationalism wants to convert a settled majority into a sort of besieged minority. Like, that's the psychological transformation there. So it's fascinating. And my next question I wanted to ask you was that instead of defining Pakistan as an idea whose imagination is extraterritorial, a non-national nationalism, as it were, not just the instability of the entity that is Pakistan, but the instability that is possibly produced in the rest of South Asia. And I'd like to ask you whether Pakistan, the specter of the ideas that it represents, not just the territory, has now perhaps plays an outsized role in South Asia, changing societies everywhere, and in a sense, making majoritarian politics the public common sense of South Asia.
Yeah, in a way, I think that in part, the process of globalization has given a huge fillip to the idea of Pakistan, because not as an Islamic state necessarily, but in terms of a highly mobile and ungrounded sense of political belonging and identification, which is, and those two things really mark the idea of Pakistan, which, never had a sacrality around territory or anything like that, though it does around borders. So that way of identifying politically, I think, has become globalized, and not just in South Asia. And you see it in all kinds of movements. So it builds loyalty in another place. So even though the territory of the nation state, of course, is valorized, that territory can also be attacked, as Muslim militants routinely do in Pakistan itself. And also you can somehow hold your identity within yourself and claim to be acting in the name of these transcendental forms of polity. So in that sense, I think Pakistan, not in its own politics perhaps, but serves as a kind of precedent. But as you know, I say in my book that in a way it's part of the Enlightenment way of thinking about politics, and there's been a kind of large-scale return of the Enlightenment, at least as a theme. We need to get back to it. We need to recover it. It's the reason and all of this stuff. So there too, it has, if you will, its room for play has increased vastly. Yeah, but it's an interesting question. I need to think about it. I
have a couple of more questions before we close. I hope we can go through. Like one of the most important ideas for me in Muslim Zion is how the imagination of numbers as destroying forms of social and political pluralism. And you refer to this correspondence between Gandhi and Jinnah, the conversation where Gandhi praises his alliance with Ambedkar. And he's happy to see a rival political formation instead of a simply communal formation. And my sense with like the rise of Hindu nationalism is that we are seeing political majorities now converted into communal majorities. That in a way, the Indian project could recover the constitution and the constitutional sense, the presence of Nehru, maybe the Congress at the helm, that we could have a sense of a political majority with shifting alliances and allegiances. But now I think the grand project of Hindu nationalism is the sort of reconversion of the political majority into a communal majority, which is why when we see this economic mess, but nothing seems to change. It's like a flat line, like it was with Trump, that nothing matters. And the question I'd like to ask you is that why do you think this imagination of numbers refuses to wither away? And in what forms can it ever wither away if it can?
Yeah, in a way, it's, Arjuna Padurai, the eminent anthropologist, has this wonderful book called Fear of Small Numbers. Yeah. And, one of the things, as you know, he argues is that it's at the very moment when the majority appears the most secure that is actually the most insecure. Why? Because what it now thinks it can do is to close the remaining gap. When there was actually a much bigger minority in place, there was no fantasy of this kind possible. At least it couldn't have really had mass appeal. And therefore, compromise and all arrangements had to be worked out. But once there's an absolute majority, what Jinnah didn't realize, once you create the absolute majority that he wanted to create, then the minority is even more in peril. Because the fantasy then is we need to just close this gap. And what you're saying is quite interesting because if you have a communal majority, then it doesn't matter what political party is in power because it's answerable to that majority. The policies might change here and there, but in fact, it will be this majority that decides whether it's in Pakistan or India or anywhere else. So number has, as it was now working quite differently. Now, but what you also said earlier was quite interesting, that the fear of a majority being reduced to a minority. So that's an old fear. It goes back to the early 20th century where you have, Mukherjee's book, Hindus, a Dying Race, which is all about the alleged greater fertility of Muslims. But quite apart from that kind of narrative, I think what this fear of being turned into a minority really tells us, this I think is, if you will, a Gandhian way of understanding it, is how even in the midst of the hatred, there is a sense that the two are intertwined, that one can become the other, that they can switch places, they can trade places. And that produces huge amounts of anxiety. But I think a Gandhi would say it is also the site of our hope, because we need to go to that site and show how actually they haven't been entirely disentangled, nor should they be. We must work from that premise. So I just wonder whether this, in a way, the identification is despite everything, continues to be remarkable. But sometimes it happens in very violent forms. So I've often thought to myself that when you're looking at the sort of new form of riot or of communal violence, often it is like people playing the role of their own enemy. They're doing what they imagine the enemy has done to them in the past. And that's one way of distancing yourself from the after effects of this really brutal violence. But it is also at the same time putting yourself in the place of your own enemy. And that is something that, people like Gandhi, etc., had understood already in the 1930s, 20s and 30s. So we are stuck with this problem. It continues to be a problem. The Jinnah solution is to disentangle and to separate, and then it'll all be all right. But as Appadurai suggests, that actually is not, that is not a good result. And we come back to the Gandhian solution, which I think is much more productive. And I certainly think it's the one we need to propound even more so today.
The final question I had, which is which again follows up from what you just said, is that one of your closing passages in Muslim Zion talks about the surreptitious pleasure of theocracy. In asserting the sovereignty of God, man in a sense has assumed the role of God himself. And could you elaborate a little bit on that? And would you also say that that is a logic that is also true of Hindu nationalism today, with the lynchings, with the sort of Ziaification of India in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much connection there, often there is a connection between the two countries. But in this case, yeah, I mean, I've increasingly come to think for modern Islam that it serves as the site for thinking about the theological in modern life in general, for all other religions, for Christians, for Hindus, when you think about the theological as a political form, you think automatically these days about Islam. But I wonder if that is actually true, because what does that thought allow us to do? It allows us to absolve ourselves of understanding the theological in our lives. It outsources it, as it were, to use a post-liberalization idea, but also that for Muslims themselves, actually the theological has become a kind of evanescent form. So that one of the things that's happening in so-called religious violence is the attempt to actually get to the theological, which they're nevertheless unable to grasp. And that the violence occurs partly because the language of the theological is no longer available. And I'm thinking in particular of these great mobilizations in protest against alleged blasphemy, right, of Muhammad, of the Prophet. And when you look, now this is one of the unfortunate gifts of South Asia to the world, because other parts of the Muslim world never had this kind of thing. It emerged out of colonial India, these great riots and protests and mobilizations over insults given to Muhammad. And the first time they become globalist goes with the Rushdie affair in 1989, that too not accidentally with Indian and Pakistani origin populations in Britain, right? Then it goes global. Now, and when you see these great disputes over blasphemy occurring, what I find interesting is that none of the terminology is traditional or theological. You use English terms like blasphemy, which don't have really Muslim equivalents. There are Islamic theological terms, but they're not used. It's fascinating. And the references are always to like the the former blasphemy laws in Britain or in Ireland, or the use of the term blasphemy in English. Whereas when you look at the Urdu usage, it's all perfectly ordinary words like Gosakhi and things which are not theological words. So there's actually an absence of the theological. And I think that's in part because the prophet has become more and more human figure. And it's considered sinful to attribute him with any semi-divine or theological character. So often the disputes over theology and over blasphemy actually end up being disputes in practice over defamation and libel. And they're dealt with like that. Now, there's, of course, a huge difference between defamation and libel as your way of thinking about an issue and the extraordinary violence that emerges from it. And I think that is the gap where you see the loss of the theological. In a way, the violence substitutes for that absence. So, sorry, it's a bit of an abstruse discussion, but now that makes me wonder whether if this is either going on in India as well in its own way, or whether there's a kind of mimicry going on of, lynchings over blasphemy in Pakistan and lynchings over beef or whatever in India. That is also possible because the two are intertwined, the two communities and the two countries. Or if, as you suggest, there is a way in which the taking of life has been wrestled into everyday individual hands. And that is one way in which otherwise subaltern figures can really achieve semi-divine status temporarily, or indeed be fully identified with the state, which is the other agency which is allowed to take lives of others. And the anthropologist Veena Das writes very interestingly about this when writing in his wonderful book on life and words, in which there are several chapters on the 1984 riots in Delhi against the Sikhs. And she's looking at the way in which, in particular, groups of Dalits attack groups of Sikhs in certain Delhi neighborhoods and what was happening. Why should the most oppressed people identify with the state in this manner? But there's a temporary identification both with the state and, if you will, with the form of sovereignty itself a theological idea that is best manifested in the taking of life.
Thank you so much, Professor Devji. That was absolutely fascinating and great learning talking to you. Before we let you go, I'd just like to ask you, I can't help but asking you, what are you working on next and what can we expect?
Well, I seem to be writing an endless set of, articles and essays on Gandhi. Once the old man gets a hold of you, he doesn't let you go very easily. But I'm also writing on Ambedkar. Yeah, and quite interesting on the idea of interest, the category of interest. Ambedkar and Savarkar, Gandhi and Iqbal, in particular, those characters, putting them together. I'm meant to be writing a book on Muhammad Iqbal, on the poet and philosopher and his political thought. And then another one, so these two books, that's one, and the other one is on contemporary Islam, again, political thought. So what I was just saying to you about blasphemy and theology and all that would be something from this book.
Okay, look forward to all of those, especially for me, the ones on Ambedkar and Iqbal. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you like what we do, please share it with your friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram for updates on all our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.